The forest air turned ice cold in a single breath. Daniel spun around, his boots skidding on the slick, damp moss. "If that gate opens, your family will never return home." The voice hung in the stagnant air. Stripped of any warmth, Maya clicked her flashlight, the beam cutting a violent path through the gloom, but the light hit only gnarled bark and tangled roots. Adam clutched his camera against his chest, his knuckles white, his eyes darting toward the dense brush. There was nothing but the sound of their own ragged breathing. The temperature plummeted further, turning their exhales into thick, gray plumes of mist that clung to the leaves. Every tree seemed to lean inward, narrowing the path behind them. They were no longer just observers in the woods. They were prey. Daniel took a step back, his heel catching on an exposed root, and he braced himself against the rough trunk of a hemlock. The forest had become a cage, the silence pressing against their eardrums with a physical weight. They stood motionless, waiting for the shadows to move, their pulses hammering in the quiet. The warning remained, echoing louder than the rustle of the wind. Something was coming, and the path home had just vanished into the dark. The silence in the woods didn't last. A low hum started, a vibration that rattled the teeth in Daniel's skull. He looked at Maya, but her flashlight beam was suddenly eclipsed by a jarring, electric flicker. The air in front of them didn't just ripple, it tore. A jagged vertical slit opened in the atmosphere, bleeding a brilliant, unnatural blue light into the forest. It widened with the sound of snapping timber. The trio scrambled backward, boots digging into the soft earth, but they could not look away. The vortex swirled, pulling dry leaves and loose dirt into its center, defying gravity. The pressure in the clearing mounted, forcing the air out of their lungs until the space between the trees began to burn with intense radiance. Then, the rotation slowed. A heavy footfall sounded on the dirt, followed by another. A figure emerged from the center of the light. He stepped out onto the moss, his presence instantly silencing the hum. The force of his arrival knocked the breath from Adam, who dropped his camera into the mud with a dull thud. They stood, paralyzed, staring at the figure who had just walked through the fabric of the world. The stranger stood motionless, his silhouette framed by the fading edges of the blue vortex. He was tall, his presence demanding every ounce of the clearing space. Behind him, a long fabric draped from his shoulders, trailing across the damp ground and glimmering with faint, shifting patterns that mirrored the night sky. He did not look at them, but his stillness was absolute. A rhythmic glow emanated from the center of his chest, a soft, pulsing light that synchronized with the faint hum lingering in the air. Each beat of the light cast long, dancing shadows against the surrounding trees. He leaned heavily on a long, carved staff. At its peak, a jagged shard glowed with a fierce, steady intensity, illuminating the dust motes swirling around him. The trio remained huddled together, their eyes fixed on the pulsing light. Daniel shifted his weight, his boots pressing into the mud, but he could not find the resolve to speak. The air around the stranger felt ionized, thick with the scent of ozone and ancient stone. The figure tilted his head, his gaze sweeping across the dark canopy above, completely ignoring the three humans trembling in his shadow. He was not just a traveler, he was an anchor, pinning the forest to something far older and far more dangerous than the world they knew. The stranger finally shifted his focus. He turned, the movement fluid and precise, and locked eyes with Daniel. The air grew heavy, pressing against their chests as he opened his mouth to speak. "I am Zyron," he said. The voice did not sound like it came from a throat. It resonated from the earth itself, deep and grinding, like stone dragging against stone. Each syllable vibrated through the damp soil, rattling the bones of the trio where they stood. Adam tried to raise his camera, but his fingers shook too violently to steady the lens. Maya stepped forward, her mouth opening to demand an explanation. But the sheer weight of Zyron's presence turned the words into a dry rasp. He did not blink. He waited, his gaze dissecting their confusion, his posture radiating a singular, terrifying authority. The forest seemed to lean in, listening to the name. Zyron tapped his staff once against a tree root. A pulse of blue light rippled outward, clearing the mist and forcing the trio to shield their eyes. When they looked back, The distance between them and the stranger seemed to have vanished. He was no longer a distant mystery. He was a problem they were now forced to solve. The fear remained, but it was being rapidly replaced by a desperate, gnawing need to know why they had been chosen. Before Daniel could form a question, the ground beneath them vanished. It did not just shake, it bucked with the force of a subterranean impact. A roar, deep and guttural, tore through the clearing, louder than any thunder. The trees groaned, their branches whipping violently in the sudden, frantic wind. Adam lost his footing first, his knees slamming into the wet dirt. Maya reached out to grab him, but the earth heaved upward, throwing her off balance. She tumbled sideways, her palms scraping against jagged stones. Daniel tried to stand, but the ground tilted at a sickening angle, forcing him down. The forest floor was no longer solid. It rippled like water under the sheer power of the tremor. Dust and loose shale erupted from the soil, choking the air. The sound was deafening, a relentless grinding of rock against rock that vibrated through their very marrow. They were pinned by the sheer violence of the movement, unable to find purchase on the shifting terrain. Every muscle in their bodies strained to keep them from being tossed into the brush. Zyron remained unmoved, his staff planted firmly, but the trio collapsed into the mud, helpless against the world that had suddenly turned against them. The violent heaving of the earth stopped as abruptly as it had begun. Silence rushed back into the clearing, heavier than before. Zyron stood over the three, his staff raised high, and slammed the base into the mountain bedrock. A shockwave, visible as a shimmering ripple, tore through the slope. The solid face of the mountain groaned, then fractured. Dust clouds billowed outward as massive slabs of rock groaned and slid aside. Behind the veil of stone, a structure emerged, a monumental archway carved into the very heart of the cliff. It hummed with a low, rhythmic vibration that made the air feel thick and static-charged. Ancient, jagged glyphs lined the frame, glowing with a soft, rhythmic light that seemed to breathe in time with their own hearts. The mountain had been hiding this for centuries, and now the seal was broken. Daniel scrambled back, his boots dragging through the loose debris, unable to look away from the sheer scale of the opening. Adam finally managed to lift his camera, but his hands were trembling too hard to focus. Maya stood slowly, her breath hitching as the light from the glyphs washed over the clearing, turning the dark forest into a landscape of shifting, surreal shadows. The path was open. The light from the glyphs faded into a dull, pulsing amber, casting long, distorted shadows across the forest floor. Without warning, the temperature plummeted. A freezing wind whistled through the stone archway, biting through skin and turning breath into thick, white plumes. Daniel shivered, his teeth clicking together as the cold settled into his joints. He retreated a step, his heels catching on a root. But he could not pull his eyes away from the pitch-black void inside the gate. Then, the silence broke. A sound emerged from the deep interior, a heavy, rhythmic dragging. It was the sound of iron scraping against stone, deliberate and slow. Every impact vibrated through the ground, a steady, measured beat that echoed like a funeral drum. Maya grabbed Daniel's sleeve, her grip tight enough to leave marks. Adam let his camera fall, the strap pulling at his neck, his gaze locked on the darkness. The footsteps grew louder, heavier, each one signaling that whatever had been waiting behind the seal was now crossing the threshold. There was no hesitation in the sound, only a relentless, crushing weight. They backed away, step by agonizing step, as the cold intensified and the dragging echo filled the entire valley. The dragging sound stopped. A massive, jagged hand gripped the edge of the stone archway, the fingers digging deep into the rock and fracturing the ancient stone. Dust rained down as the weight of the entity pulled against the threshold. With a wet, grinding tear, a hulking form forced itself into the clearing. It stood nearly twice the height of the archway, its frame composed of dark, obsidian-like plates that shifted and clicked with every movement. Thin, glowing red fractures ran across its chest and limbs, pulsing with a heat that scorched the nearby air, turning the freezing wind into a blistering gust. It did not stand upright. It hunched, its limbs dragging, forcing the ground to buckle beneath its sheer density. Every movement sent tremors through the soil, vibrating up through the trio's feet. The creature paused, turning its head slowly, a singular motion that sounded like gravel grinding in a mill. Red light spilled from its interior, casting a hellish glow over the trees. Adam dropped to his knees, his camera forgotten in the dirt. Maya clutched her head, unable to process the scale of the nightmare now towering over them. It was not just present, it was consuming the space, turning the clearing into a hunting ground. The creature roared, a sound like tectonic plates colliding, and the shockwave sent a spray of pulverized rock across the clearing. Daniel scrambled backward, his boots sliding on loose shale. "Run," he screamed, his voice cracking against the overwhelming noise. He grabbed Maya, pulling her toward the tree line, but a massive slab of earth collapsed, sealing the narrow gap between the trees. They were trapped. They stumbled, turning back to see the creature lunging, its limbs extending to close the distance in a single, devastating movement. Then, a sharp, metallic ring cut through the chaos. Zyron stepped forward, ignoring the debris raining down around him. He planted his staff firmly into the cracked soil, the ground trembling under the force of the impact. His eyes flared, turning into twin points of searing blue light that rivaled the intensity of the creature's red glow. He did not retreat. He held his position, his knuckles white as he gripped the staff, bracing for the impact of the hulking entity. The air between them hummed with static, and the space around the staff began to warp, bending the light as he prepared a final, desperate stand to buy the other's time. The clearing grew deathly still. The only sound was the high-pitched whine of energy ionizing the air. Electricity danced between the creature's jagged limbs and the staff, sparking intermittently and scorching the grass where the bolts touched down. The air tasted of ozone and burnt metal. Maya pressed her palms against her ears, her eyes fixed on the point where the blue light met the encroaching shadow. The creature stopped its advance. It lowered its head, the red fissures across its frame flaring with a rhythmic, pulsing intensity that mimicked a heartbeat. It was testing the barrier, probing for a weakness in the hum that resonated through the soil. Daniel felt the vibrations in his teeth, a grinding pulse that made his vision blur. Adam reached out, grabbing a jagged rock to steady himself, his knuckles turning pale. The tension was a physical weight, pressing down on their shoulders, making every breath a struggle. The creature's shadow stretched long and thin, swallowing the space where they stood, until the entire clearing was draped in darkness. Then, the static discharge reached a fever pitch, the air snapping with the force of 1,000 whips. The creature let out a low, guttural vibration that shook the very foundations of the mountain. It tensed its muscles, ready to launch its entire mass forward. Zyron leaned further into his staff, his posture rigid, the blue glow around him blindingly bright. The final confrontation had arrived. Zyron slammed the staff into the earth with a final guttural shout. A shockwave of pure blue energy erupted from the point of impact, tearing through the soil in a perfect, expanding circle. The air shrieked. A blinding nova of light flooded the clearing, turning the night into a searing, artificial noon. The trees at the edge of the clearing did not just fall, they atomized. Bark and sapwood disintegrated into fine dust in the span of a heartbeat. Daniel shielded his face with his arms, his skin stinging from the rapid heat surge that followed the blast. The ground beneath them bucked, forced upward by the sheer pressure of the expanding energy. Maya huddled against the cold rock face, her vision swimming in white spots. A deafening roar echoed through the valley, a sound of wood shattering and stone cracking under the immense force. The light was so intense it seemed to strip the color from the world, leaving only silhouettes against the blue glare. Then, as quickly as it had ignited, the nova surged outward and vanished, leaving behind a silence more profound than before. The clearing was unrecognizable. Where dense forest had stood, only charred stumps and pulverized earth remained. Wisps of blue vapor curled off the blackened ground, rising into the cooling night air. The dust hung heavy in the air, a thick gray veil that choked the lungs. Daniel coughed, waving his hand to clear a path for his vision. He squinted toward the center of the clearing, expecting to see a crater, a ruin, anything that signaled the end of the threat. Instead, he saw a silhouette. It was not retreating. It was not damaged. The smoke swirled around the creature as it moved forward, thick plumes parting as if pushed aside by an invisible force. The creature took one step, then another, its heavy footfalls crunching through the layer of pulverized stone and glassed earth. Not a single fissure on its frame had widened. The glowing cracks across its surface burned with the same steady, menacing light as before. Maya let out a jagged breath, her grip on the flashlight loosening until it clattered against the ground. Adam stood frozen, his camera still raised, but the device was dead, its screen flickering into a black void. The creature reached the edge of the smoke, its movements precise and fluid, showing no fatigue from the massive explosion that had leveled the forest. It stopped. It tilted its head, a motion that felt predatory and deliberate. The heat of the blast had not touched it. It had simply walked through the fire as if it were nothing more than a passing breeze. The trio stood paralyzed. Every piece of logic they possessed told them the creature should have been destroyed. Yet it stood there, looming, entirely unfazed by the force that had ripped the landscape apart. Zyron did not retreat. He held his position, but the staff in his grip began to tremble. The blue light that had permeated the clearing started to pulse erratically, growing thin and jagged. A sharp, mechanical ticking sound emanated from the crystal embedded in his chest. It flickered once, twice, then dimmed to a dull, dying amber. The glow that had sustained the barrier vanished, leaving the clearing exposed. Zyron gasped, a wet, rattling sound, and his knees hit the scorched earth with a heavy thud. He tried to push himself upright, but his arm buckled, forcing him to lean heavily against the staff. The creature stepped forward, its pace quickening as it sensed the waning resistance. Daniel watched the light fade from Zyron's chest, the reality of their situation snapping into sharp focus. They were defenseless. "We have to move!" Daniel shouted, his voice cracking. He grabbed Maya by the shoulder, pulling her back toward the tree line as the creature let out a low, vibrating hum that shook the ground. Adam looked back one final time, his eyes wide, before turning to sprint into the dark. They scrambled over the debris, their boots sliding on pulverized rock, abandoning the clearing as the creature closed the distance. The defense had failed, and now, survival was the only objective left. Branches whipped against their faces as they tore through the dense brush. Daniel surged ahead, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. Behind him, Maya stumbled, her hand grazing a jagged rock, but she didn't stop. They were running blindly, lungs burning, feet sinking into the loose soil of the mountain slope. Suddenly, a sharp metallic clang echoed through the trees. Adam had gone down. He hit the ground hard, his camera skidding across the dirt and slamming into a granite outcrop. Daniel skidded to a halt and spun around, grabbing Adam by the arm to haul him up. "Leave it!" he barked, but Adam didn't move. He was staring at the camera. The screen had flickered back to life, casting a harsh, rhythmic light onto his face. It wasn't static anymore. The ancient glyphs from the stone gate were dancing across the display, shifting and locking into place. They weren't just random carvings. Lines connected the symbols, forming a precise trajectory through the rock face. Adam tapped the screen, his fingers trembling. "Look," he gasped, pointing at the glowing path. "It is not a warning to flee. It is a map." The terror in their eyes shifted to a desperate, singular focus. They weren't just running away anymore. They were being led. Adam held the camera high, the glowing display cutting a path through the dense, suffocating undergrowth. "This way," he shouted, his voice strained. The ground beneath them sloped sharply upward, littered with loose shale that slid away with every desperate step. Behind them, the forest groaned. A heavy, rhythmic thudding vibrated through the earth, signaling the creature was closing the distance. Branches snapped, and trees splintered as the massive form tore through the thicket. Daniel pushed forward, his chest heaving, his eyes scanning the looming mountain wall for any break in the granite. "There," Maya pointed toward a hairline fracture in the rock face, barely wide enough for a person to pass. The thudding grew louder, closer, the air behind them growing thick with the scent of ozone and cooling stone. They didn't slow down. Daniel reached the wall first, slamming his shoulder into the narrow opening. He squeezed through, the jagged edges of the stone scraping against his skin. Adam and Maya followed, scrambling on their hands and knees as the shadow of the creature loomed over them. They slid into the dark, narrow fissure just as a massive obsidian claw raked across the entrance. The impact shook the entire mountain, showering them in dust and gravel. They tumbled down a steep, slick slope, falling deep into the heart of the rock, away from the light, away from the reach of the beast. They landed on cold, smooth stone, the air in the chamber still and smelling of ancient dust. Daniel stood up, his hands shaking as he brushed grit from his skin. The cavern was vast, stretching upward into shadow, but the center was dominated by three massive, monolithic crystals. They hummed with a low, bone-deep vibration that rattled the teeth. Maya moved toward the center, her flashlight beam barely catching the faceted surfaces that seemed to pull the light into themselves. Suddenly, the space beside the center crystal warped, air rippled like water, and a figure collapsed to the floor. It was Xiron. He hit the stone with a dull thud, his breathing ragged and shallow. His presence flickered in and out, the light of his essence struggling to hold form against the surrounding gloom. Daniel rushed forward, dropping to his knees beside him. "Xiron!" he shouted, but the figure only gripped the base of the nearest crystal, his knuckles white. Xiron looked up, his eyes dim, his chest heaving with every labored breath. "You found the heart chamber," he gasped, the words barely audible over the hum of the stones. He pointed toward the three monoliths with a trembling hand. "We cannot defeat it with force. We must awaken the Guardian, now." The hum grew into a roar, vibrating through the soles of their boots and rattling the very air in their lungs. Daniel took a step forward, then another, drawn by the rhythmic pulsing of the three towering monoliths. Maya and Adam followed, their faces illuminated by the faint, shifting glow emanating from within the stone. They stood before the monoliths, the surfaces smooth as glass, but cold enough to burn. Daniel looked at his companions, saw the resolve in their eyes, and reached out. He pressed his palm against the central crystal. Maya and Adam mirrored the motion, their hands meeting the cold, humming surfaces simultaneously. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then, a violent surge of azure energy tore through their bodies, snapping like lightning from the stones into their veins. Every muscle locked. Their vision flared white as the ground beneath them began to levitate. The energy was not just light, it was a weight, a current of pure, ancient force that pushed past their skin and filled the chamber. With a sound like shattering glass, a concentrated beam of brilliant azure fire ignited from the top of the crystals. It blasted upward, tearing through the solid rock of the ceiling, carving a path straight into the night sky above. The beam of azure fire struck the sky, turning the night into blinding day. Outside the mountain, the creature faltered. It raised its massive, jagged arms to shield its eyes, but the light moved faster. The energy poured over its obsidian frame, carving into the glowing red cracks that mapped its surface. A shriek tore through the valley, thin and desperate, as the creature began to fracture. Where the blue light touched, the dark stone turned to ash, drifting away on the freezing wind. The creature lunged toward the opening one last time, its fingers scraping against the stone archway. But the ground bucked with a final, violent tremor. The massive stone gate began to slide shut. It moved with a deep, grinding roar that shook the very foundation of the mountain. The creature reached into the narrowing gap, its movements slowing as the light consumed its remaining strength. With a final, thunderous slam, the two halves of the stone gate met. The glyphs flared once, then dimmed, locking into place. The shrieking stopped abruptly. A heavy, absolute silence settled over the valley, broken only by the settling of dust and the cooling of the stone. The heavy silence in the valley was finally broken by the sound of rhythmic breathing. Daniel leaned against the cavern wall, his chest heaving, his hands still trembling from the energy that had surged through him. Xiron stood a few paces away, his form flickering as his strength slowly returned. He leaned heavily on his staff, the glowing shard at its top casting long, wavering shadows against the stone. "Is it over?" Daniel asked, his voice raw. Xiron did not look at him immediately. He stepped toward the cavern entrance, gazing up at the clearing sky. With a deliberate motion, he raised his hand and pointed toward the horizon. Three distinct, brilliant blue lights ignited in the night sky, pulsing in sequence like distant heartbeats. "No," Xiron said, his voice steady but heavy with consequence. "The gate here is closed, but the work has only just begun." He turned to face the trio, his gaze lingering on each of them. "You are the only ones capable of opening the next three gates across the stars." The weight of his words hung in the air, colder than the mountain wind. The four of them turned their backs on the sealed mountain and began the trek toward the unknown. The valley floor stretched out before them, a vast expanse of gray rock and shadow. Daniel, Maya, and Adam walked in a tight formation, their footsteps echoing against the silence of the mountain pass. Xiron led them, his stride rhythmic and purposeful, his form casting a long, steady shadow under the starlight. They did not look back. Behind them, the massive stone gate stood as a silent monolith, its glyphs dark and lifeless. As they crossed the final ridge, the ground gave a faint, rhythmic shudder. It was subtle, masked by the crunch of gravel under their boots. They kept moving, unaware of the shift. Deep beneath the soil, far below the reach of the starlight and the mountain roots, the pressure of the earth began to change. The temperature rose. A wall of bedrock cracked, sending a plume of ancient dust into a hollow chamber. In that total, suffocating darkness, something vast shifted. Dirt fell away from a massive, curved surface. Then, with a sound like grinding tectonic plates, a lid of stone and scale pulled back. A singular, golden eye, miles wide and burning with an ancient, predatory intelligence, flickered open. It stared into the void, waiting.